First tonight, a senior Russian general has been killed in an explosion near his home in a Moscow suburb. Reports suggest he was walking past a parked car when an explosive device inside was detonated. No one has so far said they carried out the attack. Meanwhile, there's growing pressure on Ukraine and President Zelensky to accept Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory as part of a peace deal. This week, President Trump accused Mr. Zelensky of harming peace negotiations after the Ukrainian leader again ruled out recognizing Russian control of Crimea, a southern Ukrainian peninsula illegally annexed by Moscow in 2014. Well, now the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, has become one of the most senior Ukrainian politicians to suggest that the country might indeed have to give away territory as part of any peace deal with Russia. President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, is in Russia and is meeting President Putin. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has told American television that the US and Moscow are moving in the right direction towards a peace deal.
The Russian Investigative Committee has opened a criminal case into the murder and illegal trafficking of explosives in connection with a car explosion on Nesterova Street in Balashivka. According to preliminary information, the incident resulted in the death of Lieutenant General Yaroslav Moskalik, deputy head of the main operations directorate of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. According to available information, the detonation of the Volkswagen Golf car was caused by the triggering of an improvised explosive device. An investigative team consisting of investigators, forensic experts, and law enforcement officers has begun examining the scene of the incident.
Well, for more on developments around Ukraine, let's speak now to the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, who joins me on the line from London. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. First of all, let's start with that attack. What we saw there, a car explosion killing one of the Kremlin's top generals. What are you hearing about that?
It seems almost certain it's Ukrainians. There's no Russian group capable, really, of doing such an explosion. Moreover, there's no point in their doing it. It can't be the Americans either who are talking, and Europeans have nothing but talk. So the most obvious one is the Ukrainians have killed yet another top general as an attempt to try and dissuade Russians from occupying Ukraine.
And I mean, given the seniority of this general, what can we expect in retaliation? Are we going to see a sort of tit for tat now?
I think it gives the Russians an opportunity to, as you say, do something and say it's in retaliation for this. I would anticipate more shelling at present because what is happening is they're talking with the Americans and therefore they're going to get, I think, a great deal of what they want without further action. And therefore, as a result, I don't think they're going to make a military attack, but probably they'll shell something. As you say, into the seniority, and secondly, because this is by no means the first time they've done it, the attack might well be a building like the Ukrainian Parliament, or perhaps the presidential palace, or perhaps the administration. In short, not a civilian target, but a state target, because after all, this general is part of the state.
Well, let's move away from that and get your assessment of what the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, had to say. He was speaking in an interview with the BBC. He's the most senior Ukrainian politician to put the idea out there that Ukraine may have to cede some territory to Russia.
Yeah, the problem here is that he's not actually on President Zelensky's side, and therefore you could actually argue that he's really doing internal politics. In other words, he is suggesting and looking for votes in the long run, perhaps to become president himself, on the basis that it's time for peace, as unlike Zelensky, the war, well, not exactly warmonger, but certainly the war doer, let's put it like that. And therefore, it's not an indication that Ukraine is necessarily going to agree. It could be just part of this sort of, if you like, internal politicking. However, it is important he's spoken out, and it does imply that the opposition parties to President Zelensky may well come round to the notion of signing such a peace treaty. And this implies that were President Zelensky to step down or be coerced down by the American pressure, that therefore there is standing in the wings, waiting in the wings, somebody who's prepared to sign the necessary documents in order to arrive at peace.
Nevertheless, in spite of the political sort of maneuverings that you've talked about, I mean, could this be the area where there is some kind of compromise that allows a deal to happen? So Russia keeps the territory that it's occupied on a temporary basis, and the final status of those territories can be sorted out at some future date?
There's 3 points to make here. First and foremost, there's absolutely no question, as far as one can see, of President Zelensky or his party or the Ukrainian parliament as a whole agreeing to such terms. That has been made clear to red line. So therefore, there is no room for negotiation because the mayor of Kiev, however important he is not in charge. Number two, the galling aspect of it for Ukraine is they could have had this months and years ago. There was no need to carry on fighting and sacrifice so many of their troops and incidentally suffer so many civilian lives and, of course, collateral damage. This was a peace treaty which was quite possible before. And in fact, over the 3 years, and Donald Trump has pointed this out, he could have made such a peace offer, President Zelensky, but didn't. So there's no reason why she'd want to do so now. And on top of that, if he'd done so, then the war would have been over much earlier. And in fact, this is the business of the compromise that I was saying, although not necessarily exactly on the lines that we mentioned here, where in which, as far as one can gather, Russia's going to get virtually all at once. And thirdly, there is a problem. Russia is not known for keeping its peace treaties. And therefore, if anything is signed, and it is unlikely, then a completely different scenario is unfolding. Namely, America walks away, leaves Ukraine to try and fight on with European help. But coming back to the point, even if a peace treaty were to be signed, there's no obvious reason why it would be, as the Ukrainian president wants, just or fair or long-lasting. Please remember, Poland signed 19 peace treaties with the Russians, 3 eternal ones, and Russia's broken all 19. So it doesn't bode well.
And outside of political circles, how do Ukrainians feel about this peace proposal? A bit like Mr. Klitschko or more like President Zelensky?
As far as I can tell, on the whole, they're still more like President Zelensky. But there is a sort of bitterness growing up, I think, about America, so to speak, pandering to all Russian demands and pressurizing Ukraine to sign. After all, what we call a peace treaty is, you could argue, it's a surrender document in the sense that Ukraine is surrendering all this territory. And therefore, as far as I can tell, the Ukrainians are not so much full of righteous passion as President Zelensky gives the impression of when he's talking on television, so much as bitter that this is the most likely outcome that's facing them. However, as I say, it's more than likely President Zelensky will reject this, whereupon the war will continue.
Meanwhile, Mr. Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy, is meeting President Putin in Moscow today to talk about a peace deal. It's difficult to ask you to look into a crystal ball at the moment, but what are you expecting to come out of that?
3 things based on my books. First of all, I anticipate them actually abandoning Ukraine. Ukraine will not agree, and USA simply abandoning Ukraine, as indeed I predicted. Therefore, there is a second aspect to this. I anticipate them making deal with Russia, and it's for Ukraine to take it or carry on fighting. And if it carries on fighting, Trump will blame Zelensky for this. So he's covered his political back to that extent. I anticipate, and this is what's not being mentioned, the actual business deals, the necessity for rare earths and so on. Why do I say rare earths? Well, Ukraine has some, Russia has some, and the other country that has it is China. Well, China and America are now having a trade war, And it's more than likely that President Trump, amongst anything else, that his envoy there, Witkoff, is also discussing the possibility of such trade. It will be in return for sanctions being lifted, and more or less would normalize the relations between America and Russia. And there's a third aspect to this. Europe and Ukraine are not being invited. They're given a take it or leave it. In the meeting in London, the Ukrainians and Europeans came up with all sorts of ideas, all sorts of points. As far as I can tell, America's not interested in these points. And all that's going to happen is a deal has been made over the heads of Ukraine and Europe. And this is the deal that's going ahead. I anticipate, therefore, that Russia and America will be working together more closely soon.
Dr. Laskiewicz, thank you ever so much. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the International Affairs Analyst who was talking to me on the line from London.